Welcome to the second season of Coffee and Conflict, the National Security Institute's literary podcast, where I welcome leading experts to discuss their research, their books, and the most pressing defense and foreign policy issues of the day. I'm your host, Joshua Huminski, a senior fellow at NSI and senior vice president of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. So grab your first or second coffee of the day and let's begin. I'm joined today by Emma Ashford. She is a senior fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program at the Stimson Center. Prior to joining the Stimson Center, she was a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's New America Engagement Initiative, which focused on challenging the prevailing assumptions governing U.S. foreign policy. She was also a research fellow in defense and foreign policy at the Cato Institute, where she worked on a variety of issues, including U.S.-Saudi relations, sanctions policy, U.S. policy towards Russia, and U.S. foreign policy and grand strategy more broadly. Her first book, Oil, the State and War, The Foreign Policies of Petrostate, was published by Georgetown University Press in 2022. But she joins us today to discuss her exceptionally timely and thought-provoking new book, First Among Equals, U.S. Foreign Policy in a Multipolar World, out now from Yale University Press. Emma, welcome to Coffee and Conflict.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
I'm really excited to dive into this book conversation with you because it is, as I said, exceptionally interesting, very, very thought-provoking, and really timely. But I want to start with the subtitle of the book, which is U.S. Foreign Policy in a Multipolar World. And I really want to get your diagnosis of how do you define this present geostrategic landscape? I mean, what do you mean by a multipolar world?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a chapter in the book in which I dig into this debate, which I think has been running for a couple of years now in the foreign policy community about, if the unipolar moment is over, and we had a big argument about whether the unipolar moment is over, what is emerging? Is it going to be more a US-China bipolar competition that's going to look something like a new Cold War? And that was very much in vogue in Washington for a couple of years. Or is it going to be something different? What scholars would call multipolarity, right? Are there going to be more countries that matter than just the US and China? Now, I think one of the reasons why that debate is so long running and so frustrating is because you can sort of look at different metrics and you can cherry pick pretty much any answer that you want from them. If you look at military power or economic power, I look in the book at a lot of different metrics and sort of say, well, look, taken holistically, I think we have a picture of the world emerging that looks kind of like this. The US and China, most important countries, most powerful, they're out ahead of the pack, but they're not so far out of the pack that other countries don't matter. And I also see this variety of capable regional or middle states, everything from, Russia to Turkey to India to Brazil, they matter as well. And so for me, I think multipolarity, unbalanced multipolarity is a pretty decent way to think about this world.
But sort of how did we come to this moment? Because if we leave the time of the end of the Cold War, we had sort of the end of history, Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, and then we had sort of the American hyperpower moment, and then a post 9/11 era where the U.S. was exercising power globally, almost without restraint. So how did we end up in this sort of multipolar moment, and at what point did we really leave the unipolar moment?
I think perhaps my most meta comment in this book is that really we could have left the unipolar moment at any one of a dozen points in the last few years. And I imagine that when historians actually write books about this post-Cold War period, they'll pick different times, right? Everything from the 2008 financial crisis, which is when people really started talking about the decline in US power, war in Ukraine, war on terror, all of these different things. So for me, I think it's important to say that this is a process, not a single moment. And how I tend to think about the unipolar moment, this period of, pronounced American global predominance, I tend to think of it a little bit like the rise and fall of that predominance, right? So we have the 1990s, the US is extremely and increasingly active in world affairs, focusing in on everything from, humanitarian interventions in the Balkans to the expansion of NATO in Europe. talking about genocide and human rights and nuclear proliferation, and sort of rising up through the war on terror, where the US becomes even more interventionist overseas, and then slowly over the decade and a bit after that, the sort of declining public support, declining elite support for this approach to the world as some of the negative consequences of it become apparent. So again, I don't think of this as a single moment question. I think of it as a process.
Sort of the idea of what Hemingway said about becoming bankrupt is sort of slowly then all at once. But I'm curious when you look at sort of the American political discourse about this, though, because the overwhelming sense in the way that America's collective vision of itself remains sort of the primary power, the dominant power. And there seems to have been, and correct me if I'm wrong, this fundamental tension between sort of the elite politics, the elite worldview, the self identity, if you will, of being this power and being able to act in this way, but the world shifting sort of beneath America's feet. And I'm curious how you see that sort of that disconnect between the foreign policy perspective and the world as it is.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, first of all, there are sort of two things shaping the foreign policy debates that we're having today. One is the failures of some of those policies during the unipolar moment, right? The American public starts to feel much more strongly about foreign policy than they used to after we start to spend decades in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the other thing that is shaping the foreign policy debate is these big global trends, the shifts in power, right? The rise of China, but it's not just China, the rise of other states as well, the growing importance of other actors in international relations. And I think in both cases, right, that public sentiment, the souring of the public on US foreign policy, and those global trends, my sense is that elites were a lot slower to grasp this than the average person on the street. Who knew something about foreign affairs. And in part, I think that's because elites in Washington were very much ensconced in sort of a bubble, talking about transatlantic unity or America as the indispensable nation, with far less focus on the ways in which, the world might be starting to push back a little on the United States. And so I do think that now we're in a place where elites have at least acknowledged and started to understand that there are things they need to rethink about foreign policy, but it took a very long time to get here.
And as a follow on from that, what you really write about, I think, very much in the second half of the book, is the idea of this realist internationalism. And could you unpack what you mean by that, and how does that differ from previous ideas of sort of realism and sort of internationalism, to use both of those phrases? I mean, we go back to Tony Blair, and I think it was a liberal internationalism or interventionism as kind of was his idea. But what does realist internationalism mean in your mind?
Yeah, so the front half of the book is basically description, right? How we got here and how I think the world is shifting. And then the back half of the book, the part about realist internationalism, that's prescription, right? It's what I think the US should do to adapt to this world. And one thing that I ended up arguing in the book is I don't think we need some new innovative grand strategy, right? Naming it realist internationalism notwithstanding, this is not a strategy that is something new that I have developed. This is in many ways just picking up classic concepts that policymakers and scholars have looked to for decades, for centuries, even in different contexts, and trying to apply them once again to US foreign policy. And the reason why I chose those two words, realism and internationalism, is first of all, I wanted to make very clear that this is a strategy grounded in realism, which is to say it focuses on national interests, it focuses on more narrow interests. It's not about being the world policeman or the indispensable nation. But at the same time, I wanted to put internationalism in there because I think there's this common misconception that realism is about American retreat from the world. It's about America refusing to engage. We're not going to be as present. We're not going to do anything overseas. We're just going to withdraw behind our oceans and not do anything. And I think that's a fundamental misreading of many realist theories, but particularly mine, which suggests maybe somewhat less military engagement in some places, but, continuing to engage in diplomacy and trade and other areas. So for me, that's why both parts of this phrase are quite important.
Sticking with that, I mean, one of the criticisms that has been levied against the United States for many, many years is we're kind of bad at grand strategy. So, I mean, have the failings that we've had thus far in terms of applying various schools of thought been a systemic function, or is it just sort of consequences of just the challenges within the institutions of government to mobilize, the DIME aspects of foreign policy and capabilities?
Look, I mean, we are bad at grand strategy, at least as at least as it's construed in a very classic sense, right? The notion that an incoming administration sits down and writes a national security strategy, and all the agencies take this and run with it, and implement it in ways that the president would like, right? That's an idealized process. That's not really how it works in practice. In practice, grand strategy is somewhat more emergent. There are crises that pop up and change the course of events. We don't necessarily do this in that very specific way. But I still think grand strategy is really important because I think it is our way of trying to build a mental model of the world and how we should react to it. And even if the only thing that policymakers actually take from a grand strategy book like this is some general principles that they will apply to circumstances going forward, for me, that's still very valuable because it's more effective to have a consistent set of principles to work from than it is to simply greet every situation in an ad hoc sense. And I think it also serves in many ways to sort of heighten the tensions and the differences between differing opinions on foreign policy. So, understanding why my proposed strategy is actually fundamentally quite different from that of the Biden administration, even though both are internationalist in orientation, even though both have some realist elements in place, I think understanding those differences is extremely important.
I do want to come to the Biden administration and certainly the Trump presidency as well. But specifically, when you unpack realist internationalism in your mind, what are the tenets that you would advise policymakers to adopt if they were to take this and apply it?
Yeah, I mean, look, so the first and most important is to narrow the scope of US interests. During the unipolar moment, and this is something I sort of get into in the first part of the book and the history, our purported interests in the world expanded from being not just the security and prosperity of the American homeland, but also the security and prosperity of each and every one of our many allies. It expanded to include things like human rights overseas, the promotion of democracy, the prevention of substantial nuclear proliferation. And you could have an argument on each of these on the merits, I think, but the fact is that as all of these get added into US foreign policy, it becomes much more of a hodgepodge, and we basically stop being able to prioritize, stop being able to center those original interests, security and prosperity of the American people. And it becomes much harder to make decisions for policymakers. So for me, starting to think once again about core interests is the most important part of this. Then there are other somewhat more practical steps, right? So one is reconceptualizing how we think about US alliances, right? So that they are means and not ends in and of themselves. So we want to think about alliances. Now, there may be allies that we are very close to, that we have long working relationships with, but nonetheless, we want to start thinking of alliances as tools, things that we actually use to achieve those core goals rather than something that we try to keep for its own sake. Then we want to think about how we prioritize US resources, because for me, the fundamental of strategy is bringing means and ends into alignment. In an era of increasing constraints on the US, we want to think about how to use the resources we have best. That means prioritizing. And it's not particularly original to say that we should pull back from Europe and the Middle East in order to prioritize the Indo-Pacific, but it is certainly something we've not succeeded in doing. And I think that's where policymakers really have to focus. And then finally, I think in order to do that, again, on the alliances side, burden shifting is really something that policymakers have to get quite serious about. It is no longer enough to simply say we protect US allies everywhere because they're allies. We have to talk about how to balance that relationship in ways that benefit both sides. So there's a lot else of other things in the book, but I think that's the basics.
And taking a look at specifically the Trump presidency, certainly from 2016 and then fast forward to 2024, It seems like if we go back to the beginning of the conversation where you talked about sort of the American people being ahead of Washington in many ways and understanding and grappling with the role of American power and primacy in the world and how it was fundamentally shifting. It seems in some ways that kind of what you're outlining, although certainly not entirely, elements of this sort of America first idea framework, if you will, seem to kind of align with a realist internationalist, or at least the realist portion of the realist internationalist. So was the American people just sort of ahead of the game and kind of understanding that this moment was shifting and we needed to adapt it? And how does President Trump's sort of America first framework fit within your prescribed grand strategy idea? And how
Yeah,
does
look,
it differ?
I tend to agree with Walter Russell Mead in his diagnosis of the American people, which is that they're fundamentally what he calls Jacksonian, right? They're perfectly comfortable with the use of force, the use of the military overseas, but they don't want to go abroad in search of other people's monsters to destroy, right? They fundamentally want to see a US foreign policy that is focused on the national interest. And I tend to both think that that's a good idea and believe that that's where the majority of the American people are. And in some ways, I think that's why this branding of President Trump's foreign policy as America first has actually been very successful. It conveys in a small number of words to the American people that the foreign policy that he's trying to pursue, it's for you, it's for the American people. Now, he hasn't always actually pursued foreign policy that meets that standard, at least in my opinion. But I think part of the reason he's been so successful is that, especially after 30 years of sort of Middle Eastern misadventures and regime change and nation building, that's a very attractive vision for the United States public. And I think what we see is, if we contrast that again, perhaps with the Biden administration, where Biden, especially after the invasion of Ukraine, continued to talk about America's role in the world, our sacred alliances, as the indispensable nation. It was easier to sell that in the 1990s when it didn't cost as much and there weren't many failures to look at. Today, it's extremely hard to sell that to the US public. So with all of that said, I think you're absolutely right that the current administration's foreign policy and the vision that I lay out in this book have some commonalities. I think, again, the sort of the nationalist to national interest orientation of it, the focus on burden shifting, alliances as tools, the focus, I believe, although we don't actually have strategy documents yet, but the focus on certain regions, on the Western Hemisphere, on the Indo-Pacific, I think all of that does line up. There are certainly many places where the implementation diverges from what I would consider to be ideal here. And then I'll flag, and perhaps we can talk a little bit more about this later, but the one point of significant departure for me is on the economic side. Mm-hmm. Which is to say, I favor a relatively open, diverse trading environment globally. I think that, making our economy accessible to others and working with other states and technology and all of these things, I think that's one of our biggest strengths. The Trump administration is clearly in the opposite camp on that question.
It's actually, you got ahead of me and actually kind of trumped one of the points I wanted to ask about. That is, I mean, the president very much has a view of not so much self-containment and not isolation, I don't think is the right phrasing for it, but being increasingly self-reliant within the United States economically, and focusing and narrowing certainly on a core set of interests, possibly hemispheric in nature, depending on what the national security, national defense strategy presents. But can you, in your mind, have both, if you will? Sort of a very focused approach on interest-based foreign policy, and at the same time, sort of an economic engagement strategy? Or is it fundamentally the two are not necessarily contradictory, perhaps, but they don't fit very well, or at least they're not being pursued in the way that you would suggest?
Look, I mean, I actually think they fit together surprisingly well. I think that if you look at the sweep of history, our economic engagement and our sort of military engagement have often not flowed together. They've often been in different places. And I mean, I'm very skeptical of some of the arguments that you hear in Washington that say pulling back US military forces from Europe is going to undermine US-Europe trade, for example, right? Because for me, there are structural economic reasons why there is so much trade between the US and Europe, right? It's to do with the development levels of our economies. It's to do with the kinds of trade both parties want to engage in. So to me, I don't think it's necessarily the case that military and economic have to go hand in hand. The one exception to this, right, is that there are places where potentially if the US is not engaged militarily, we could find ourselves pushed out economically. And for me, this is the primary reason to actually focus on Asia, to focus on the Indo-Pacific. It's not so much that I'm concerned about, let's say, the defense of Taiwan. I also don't really think China is about to invade the whole region. But I am concerned about growing Chinese influence in Asia and the ways in which that could make it hard for us to access markets and sea lanes in Asia. And so for me, that's the one area where I see that risk. And so I would advocate some military engagement in order to mitigate that risk. But in other regions, I don't see that risk to the same extent.
I mean, if we look back, certainly, the lost decade, as has been argued in a previous book and one that we've discussed before, but sort of the period from 2011, to 2021, the attempt to shift to the Indo-Pacific, the pivot to the Indo-Pacific, we've been trying to do this for a number of years and been remarkably unsuccessful in doing so. The running joke about the Middle East is, it's very much like the mafia. Like you try to leave and they pull you right back into it. So in trying to balance these priorities and attempting to reallocate resources in alignment with the interests, are we just sort of doomed systemically to kind of keep doing the same thing over and over again? Or do you see this as a truly an inflection point? I mean, you write about President Trump being the first unipolar president. I mean, is this a point in your mind where we are starting to shift, or are we just sort of doomed to rhetorically shift, but practically get stuck in the same morass?
First post-unipolar president, I think very important to say that. Look, I actually start the preface to the book with this quote from Gramsci that is well known and often misquoted. The Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, he wrote in his prison notebooks, he said, the old world is dying, the new world is not yet born. And in the meantime, a variety of morbid symptoms can be expected to appear. And I tend to think that's roughly where we are in foreign policy at the moment, right? We have left the unipolar moment. I think the bipartisan consensus that governed US foreign policy during that period is dead. What I don't think we have is a new consensus, and that is really problematic. And things like our inability to pivot to Asia since the Obama administration, I think, are very emblematic of this sort of limbo period in which we find ourselves. I do not think we're necessarily doomed to stay in it forever. And one of the things that I try to do in the book is, in addition to these broad principles, I dig down into each of the sort of three major regions and talk about what would actually be necessary to implement this in practice. And it looks different in different regions. In the Middle East, it really is primarily a question of political will. We could leave very quickly without significant risks if we chose to do so. It's on the president at the time to make that decision and make the case to the American people. I think like the withdrawal from Afghanistan would be another example. In Europe, it's partly a political will problem, but it's as much to do with the question of who replaces US capabilities and the inability of European states to sort of come together in a coherent form to actually accept some of that burden shifting. Now that has changed, even since this book was written, that has changed, I think, in Europe, but that speaks more to a process of trying to, signal to Europe that the US is leaving in some time period so that there is an impetus among European states to fill those gaps, and it's done in a reasonable manner over a period of 10 plus years. So, I mean, again, I don't think these are structural problems that cannot ever be overcome, but it is going to take some level of political will, and more importantly, it's going to take planning, right? And actually implementing that plan. And I think that's the real problem the prior administrations had, is they were very keen to pivot to Asia, but they didn't have any particular plan for how to get out of existing commitments.
And I want to stick with Europe there, because it's a very interesting point that you raise about the idea of burden shifting and away from sort of burden sharing and the sources of sort of European leadership in this. I mean, if we look back at sort of 2016, the expectation was that Hillary Clinton was going to become president, and it was almost going to be more of the same from a European perspective. President Trump comes in, sort of upsets the apple cart, and starts making clear expectations and demands of European partners and allies within the NATO structure. And it's sort of there's a sense of sort of bargaining, accommodation, and then okay, we're good. And then President Biden is like a breath of fresh air and relief. Like we're back to some sort of normalcy. And then President Trump comes back and says, "Hi, I'm back. I have a lot of these expectations. Nothing has fundamentally changed." Is Europe? I mean, one of the things that we heard earlier this year was that this is a watershed moment. Things have fundamentally changed. Europe is finally going to stand up. We had the Hague summit with the 5%. How do you see Europe? I mean, certainly since drafting of this book, responding to this environment. I mean, is this a sea change where we're going to see the burden really shifting to Europe, or is this more of the various stages of grief, which is not a great great analogy, but we've gotten through the bargaining, we're kind of acceptance, and now we're sort of next phase to follow?
No, I think that's actually a really good metaphor for it. If I compare, the things that I heard from Europeans in the Trump 1 presidency versus now, we have absolutely moved from anger and grief into acceptance, right? The question is to what extent they're actually going to be able to capitalize on this. And some of that is outside of the United States' control. I've long thought of it in terms of sort of, economics problems, right? When it comes to the transatlantic alliance, we've got a free rider problem with the Europeans, right? Which is they really like to, make the US pay for it. Who wouldn't want that? But that's actually not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is the collective action problem, right? Which is that Europe, not a unified actor, all these different countries, finds it very difficult to come together and prioritize. I mean, we find it difficult to do that, and we're one country. And it's that collective action problem that I think still poses the biggest hurdle for European states to overcome. We've seen some steps towards overcoming it, things like some of the joint European Union financing ventures, some of the joint procurement policies that have come into place. But there's still all these old divisions, right, about who is going to provide troops. Can the French be trusted not to do their own thing? Will it always be the Poles that are having to defend people? And so it is fundamentally difficult. What I have seen, I think, even just in the last year but certainly since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, is those collective action problems are being overcome. And what is leading to that is the feeling of threat, right? That they face a threat and that the US might not be there. And that is helping them to move towards resolution on some of these issues. So I'm fairly confident that if these trends continue, that we will see some version of European defense cohere. In what form, it's harder to say.
And sticking with you mentioned sort of Germany and France, but we also looking to sort of Japan and India and Turkey and sort of these other second tier powers, if you will. I mean, what role do they play sort of in this multipolar world, and how do we, in terms of the United States, look to interact with them in the future to pursue sort of these interests? Is it more of sort of continued engagement but on a narrower structure, or do we start looking at this burden shifting to some of these other countries and territories in sort of mini lateral engagements?
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the reasons why I think it's really important for me to say this is multipolarity is because I genuinely think these regional powers are extremely important to the United States going forward. And to China, for that matter, right? These are the states that maybe they can't go toe-to-toe with the US globally, but they can certainly constrain the United States in their home region. They can help the United States to block China, to do other things, to shape their home regions. And so for me, that's really important. And we have to think about how we interact with and work with these states. Now, again, not to sort of focus on the Biden administration all the time, but I think there's a nice sort of counterpoint here. The Biden administration, I think, very much tried to build coherent alliances that could pull together into something global, right? They really wanted to stitch together NATO with America's alliances in the Indo-Pacific into some broader coalition of advanced industrialized democracies or something like that. They found it very difficult to do that because not all these regional states want to do that. The Indians, for example, definitely don't want to do that. Come to that, some NATO members don't want to do that, right? Turkey definitely doesn't want to do that. The sort of partnerships that I think I would like to see are much more flexible, right? They're specifically focused on one set of issues, one topic, right? So maybe we have one coalition of countries that is particularly concerned about Chinese maritime violations in and around the South China Sea. And maybe we have an entirely different set of coalition partners who are concerned about high-tech innovation and intellectual property theft, for example, right? We have different coalitions on different issues. And as part of that, we also don't necessarily just have US allies that are dependents, right, who follow us on everything, but we have to provide all the capabilities. We have US allies that are more capable. So I think this is in some ways distinct from burden shifting and maybe is more like actual real burden sharing, not the Washington meaning of the word, right? But it's in the US interests to have these other capable states that are democracies, that are friendly to us. It's in our interests to have a more militarily capable Japan, South Korea, Germany, because they help to act as this backstop for US power. And the more that they are powerful, the more that we sort of all benefit from this.
Extrapolating from that, though, the having more capable partners, more capable allies, also means relinquishing some level of sort of leadership and control, however ephemeral that control may actually be. And it seems to be that that's going to be a friction point or point of discomfort. I mean, we've long looked at to NATO and said we want a more capable NATO, so long as you buy American and do what we say. And now we're getting to the point where you have real European strategic autonomy potentially emerging. But the consequence of that might be divergences of sort of foreign policy interests, or maybe perhaps not maybe extreme, but solutions for various problem sets. So how do you see that friction, that tension manifesting and being resolved within the system of sort of American foreign policy?
Look, I think one place where, getting right down into the weeds with this administration, where I have some serious problems with their approach, is on these specific questions of, European strategic autonomy and where they get their weapons, right? If Europe is going to actually be an autonomous military and strategic actor, then they need a European defense industrial base that can meet those needs. Buying American doesn't do that. And in this case, this administration is far more interested in weapons sales than they are in the alternative. Another example would be this administration, like pretty much every administration, came into office and said, well, European strategic autonomy is great, but we want the Supreme Allied Commander Europe to remain an American. Which I think would be one obvious step towards giving Europeans some more control. So it's problematic, right? That these things push against each other. I mean, I do think, and here's sort of where I think the Trump administration is getting it wrong and the Biden folks got it right, there is the potential for an administration that understands that it's important for at least some elements of a defense industrial base in Europe to be European and to accept, right, that we maybe will have slightly less control or influence over the policy process in these states in exchange for those capabilities. So, I mean, for me, at a fundamental level, if it is a trade-off between autonomy of allies and military capabilities, I am comfortable with them having more autonomy in exchange for those capabilities. And in large part, that is because for most US allies, there's only so far they're really going to drift from core US interests. I don't see, I mean, look, I'm a British American dual citizen, right? But I don't see Britain going off and joining China and everything anytime soon.
Well, they're just going to have a very large embassy potentially next to the Tower of London, which is slightly uncomfortable, shall we say?
Well, feels on point.
One of the things that we haven't really talked about, but it is a bit of a divergence, and certainly from the Biden administration to the Trump presidency, but even certainly from the unipolar moment, was the value and the role, of values in foreign policy. I mean, you're talking about very much about an interest-based approach, but for such a long period of time, it was the promotion of human rights, promotion of democracy, be it sort of a Democrat or Republican, neoconservative perspective. But where do the values fit in this? I mean, can the United States promote values? Should it promote values? And how do those fit with sort of this realist internationalist approach?
Look, I think I struggle with this question. I think Americans going all the way back to the founding have struggled with this question. You can find George Washington wrestling with this question. I think I actually tend to come down where some of those very early American thinkers did on this question, which is America is best in spreading values when it acts as an example rather than as, somebody trying to actually go out and sort of spread democracy, spread values by the sword. And I think what we've seen over the last 3 decades is simply that approach is not that effective. We're not very good at nation building. We're not very good at democracy promotion. There are very few cases I can point to where we've actually been successful. And if that is the case, if we're not very good at it and it has side effects that we don't like, then we probably shouldn't be doing it. That doesn't mean that I want US foreign policy to abandon values altogether, right? There are plenty of places where, at the margins, we can take steps that might help in other countries. And I'll give you one example, right? So sanctions, we put on a lot of big, heavy sanctions on, Russian oil and all different kinds of things. But we also have these individual personal sanctions that we can apply to dictators that steal their people's money and stop them or make it more difficult for them to move it through Swiss bank accounts, right? That's the kind of small step that doesn't really cost us that much in many cases in foreign policy and helps in some small way. So there are places where marginally we can probably shift the dial, but for the most part, the values that I want policymakers to focus on are actually the preservation of democracy and liberalism here at home. I want us to keep those things far more than I want us to go out and try and spread them around the world.
I want to look at sort of the two most pressing national security and foreign policy challenges that the United States faces right now, which is Russia's war against Ukraine and Russia writ large, but then also the People's Republic of China and the Indo-Pacific domain. If you were to look at sort of starting with Russia and apply this realist internationalist perspective, what policy corrections would you make to America's foreign policy on Russia? And then we'll do the same on the PRC.
Yeah, I mean, look, I supported the Biden administration's policy in the early days of the war in Ukraine. I think it was right to arm Ukraine and help them try to resist the Russian invasion. I think where my prescriptions diverged and would diverge is that we didn't know when to stop. Right? We, instead of considering when Ukraine might have had the greatest leverage in negotiations, I think, some early wins really encouraged very triumphalist thinking, and we sort of ended up saying, well, we'll just keep going as long as we need to until Ukraine, wins everything. And as a result, I think Ukraine is in a far worse position today than it would have been. So I would not just talk about opening negotiations now. I wanted to do it much earlier. And I do think that even aside from the Ukraine question, the US does need to normalize at least diplomatic relations with Russia. There are other things that we need to be able to talk to the Russians about, the Arctic, nuclear issues. And we've let a lot of that become subordinate to the war in Ukraine in ways that I think are actually quite harmful to the US interest. So, I mean, I support what this administration has done in sort of pushing Ukraine, first pushing on the peace side of things, and then pushing Europeans to do more because they're closer to the problem. But again, I think we may have missed our window for negotiation, and that does leave us in a very problematic place.
I think it was General Milley, what was it, circa 2023 or something like that, the New York Economic Club or Chicago Economic Club had mentioned something very similar in saying the goal was to position Ukraine in a point of military strength to enter into negotiations, and was very quickly shot down by the Biden administration about that for any fear of presenting a lack of unity amongst the allies and whatnot. So it's very interesting that you highlight. But looking at the People's Republic of China and the desire of the administration, or some of the elements within the administration, to pivot to the Indo-Pacific. We have the Undersecretary of Defense, Albert Colby, has the strategy of denial, his book, and very much focused on laser-like on deterring the PRC. And then we have the economic engagement side from the White House and President Trump trying to reach the great big deal with President Xi Jinping. What would you suggest, or what would you advise this administration and this president to apply the realist internationalist framework to the PRC challenge?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think our China strategy has been, frankly, incoherent across the last few administrations. We sort of see this very increasingly hard line approach, particularly in the economic space, towards, export controls, related issues. Um, and now this administration has kind of started with that and is reversing course. We have no, I think, consensus in Washington on how to handle Taiwan. That's a real problem. Look, I tend to think of the China challenge as somewhat a military problem, predominantly an economic one. In military terms, I think we need to reapportion our forces in the region, right? So move them to places where they are better situated if we're concerned about US China rivalry. So that might mean less South Korea, for example, and more Philippines, to give just one example. It probably means fewer land forces, more air and naval. Um, and then we need to start thinking about flashpoints. And I think Taiwan here really is the key problem, right? Taiwan is so close to China. The historical and other ties between the PRC and Taipei make it so that, really, I think we would probably get pulled into a major war if we tried to defend Taiwan. To me, that speaks to the porcupine model of enabling Taiwan to try and defend itself, or at least to deter Chinese aggression against the island. Now, it's problematic that the Taiwanese don't seem to want to go down that road. And if they don't, there's only so much that I think we can do. But I would be much more firm about defending Japan or South Korea if it ever came to it, right? I think we should be very clear that those are, the core US interests are served by defending them. So that's the military side. On the economic side, I mean, look, it's hard to sell free trade anything in this political environment, but we need to do better than the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which the Biden administration, it was their signature policy in the Indo-Pacific, and I haven't heard a regional partner say a good thing about it. It really just doesn't have any substance. We need to think more about economic engagement with countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, and how we actually would reach out to them. I would also like to see us increase our diplomatic strength, which is something that doesn't seem to be happening under this administration. So sort of a mixed bag of things, but I think we should be much more focused on the Indo-Pacific as the one area where US interests really are at stake. And we've given so much of our attention to Europe and the Middle East in recent years.
Following on from that, I mean, if the leaks are to be believed about the national defense strategy, national security strategy, there's almost a neo-Monroe doctrine in the offing for sort of the administration's focus on not just the southern border, but also the entire hemisphere. I think there are several carrier battle groups heading to or already in the Caribbean, a pretty significant presence of other vessels. What do you make of this administration's pivot towards this hemisphere? And is this a function of sort of a new realist approach to self-sufficiency and potentially trying to deter the PRC from being in the Western Hemisphere? And so how does this fit within your framework?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think like most realists, the focus on the Western Hemisphere part of an offshore balancing strategy has so long been a core part of this that most people don't even mention it, right? They say, well, the three important regions are Europe and the Middle East and Asia. And of course, we have hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. That has actually slipped in recent years. And so to some extent, I think, as a realist, I have some concerns about Chinese encroachment into Latin America. I have some concerns about the Arctic and our interests there. And we really haven't focused on those issues at all in recent years. But again, I think like a lot of realists, for me, this is sort of a like the monkey paw curls. I wanted us to focus on the Western Hemisphere, but I don't really want us to do it like this. I don't want regime change in Venezuela. I don't want the entire U.S. Navy in the Caribbean conducting strikes on small boats. Again, I would emphasize, I think, the economic part of engagement here. We are so concerned about migration and drug flows. And yet there has been no significant policy process under any administration in the last 20 years since NAFTA to actually try and build economic engagement paths into Latin America. right? I mean, it might sound crazy to say, well, what we need is NAFTA to cover the whole of the Western Hemisphere. But actually, if countries in Latin America were better integrated into supply chains that fed industries here in the US and vice versa, we would probably have fewer problems with migration. We would probably have fewer problems with drugs. The problem is that we're focused almost entirely on the military aspect of this. So, long story short, the Western Hemisphere, I really do think it's very important. I'm not sure this administration is going about it in the right way.
It is fascinating the extent to which the PRC element and sort of that hemispheric engagement component has sort of been lost in a lot of the conversation. The Arctic and conversations about Greenland, certainly, but the way it has been portrayed and missing that key component is sort of broader American foreign policy, because as you said, it's been taken for granted, but we haven't really been paying much actual attention to it and the implications thereof. And we're coming up to the tail end of the conversation here. And finally, for national security professionals, certainly, and the audience for this podcast in Washington, but also more broadly, I mean, what are the most urgent mindset shifts or like institutional reforms required for the U.S. to really operate as a first among equals? Because this very much seems instinctively just different and sort of a challenge where it's not just the United States huzzah hegemony. We're in a new, as you said, we have to be first among equals in this multipolar world. But what are those changes in your mindset that you would want policies to or professionals to have?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's a great question. And I think often, as somebody who's a little bit outside the foreign policy consensus in Washington, often as I'm talking to folks, as I'm looking around at what's being written, it strikes me that this is one of our biggest problems, is just this persisting mindset that comes straight from the 1990s on through. The notion that America is, as Madeleine Albright put it right, the indispensable nation. We stand taller, we see further into the future. This is something she actually said in like 1997 on TV. And I think for policymakers, when you've spent sort of 3 decades being, top dog in the world, when no one has really pushed back on you because you're too powerful, when you've come to believe that the US is always a force for good in the world, it can be really, really hard to retreat, right, in any sense. And I don't say that in a pejorative or a negative way. It can be really hard to think about how you realign your resources. How do you pull back in one area so that you can lean forward in another? If you can do everything, as this mindset suggests, then you don't need to do that. And I think we do still see this come through in, many documents that are still written in the national security community. I'll point to the Commission on the National Defense Strategies report, which was published, I think, a year or two back at this point. But they advocated, right, that the US shouldn't do anything different. And in fact, we should increase defense spending to 5 to 7% of GDP to make it work. And we should cut entitlements and we should raise taxes to do that. Now, to me, that sounds completely disconnected from any polling I've seen of the American public, who, not only don't want their benefits cut and their taxes raised, but when you ask them about how they see the US role in the world, they say it's about shared leadership, working together to solve problems. For the most part, if especially if you look at folks under the age of 50, very few people say they think the US should be this indispensable nation model. So for Washington, moving past that, I think is going to be really hard, but it's something that we are going to have to do because we're moving into this period of more normal international contestation between great powers. If we're going to thrive in that, we need to make changes.
Well, it sounds like we're going to have to put Washington on the therapy couch to try to work through some of these challenges. I think on that note, that's going to bring our episode to a close. I really want to thank you, Emma, for joining us today. Thank you, as always, to Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, the entire NSI staff, in helping produce today's episode. Coffee and Conflict is available on Spotify and other fine purveyors of podcasts. This episode will also be available on YouTube and NSI's homepage. Make sure you join us for our next episode in just 2 short weeks. And as always, if you like what you've heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.